Okay.
Fantastic colleagues from our seatbelt clients.
Okay, guys, we're gonna start. I don't know if there's anybody there. Okay. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to the Free Peoples of Russia House. My name is Yevhen, and whoever been here may know me in a different capacity, but today I decided to moderate because the topic is very near to me. I know very well how to negotiate with Russians because my wife is Russian. So, it's my first time moderating, so don't judge too hard. And I would like to introduce our guest today, Dr. Donald Jensen. He's a distinguished expert on Russian foreign security policy. He currently teaches Russian foreign policy at Johns Hopkins University and is a former U.S. diplomat who participated in key arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union. He was part of the first American inspection team to verify Soviet missile sites under the INF Treaty, and he's widely published analyst of Russian state behavior with a particular focus on negotiating strategy. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Good to see friends, and thank you for all of you coming out on a hot Friday evening. I could immediately before too long. We're going to have a question and answer session.
Yes.
But I want to start with, first of all, I was her age when I started negotiating with the Russians. I was a staffer at the start in SDI negotiations, face-to-face and supporting the negotiations in Geneva for several years. And so I was a very young foreign service officer and took an interest in all of this stuff at that time and then followed it through a variety of venues since then. Thus, the negotiations about the Ukraine war in particular are very interesting to me, as have been, going backward, a number of the other bilateral discussions since Putin came to power. Subsequent arms control, Iran, Minsk Treaty, Ukraine talks before, in the run-up to the war, and of course the Ukraine talks now. And so I wanted to start by just reading. I hate when people read stuff. I'll read shortly. 3 things and ask you the obvious question. Let me read the 3 things first. On June 2nd, the President's Arms Control Special Representative, talking about the negotiations between the U.S. and Russia over Ukraine, said this, quote, "We have come to what we call the lists of conditions. The lists of conditions are what it looks like. We believe that this is your end state. We took the Ukrainian list of conditions, then what the Russian list of conditions is, put these together and to merge them to get to the end state. How do you put those things together? We feel pretty confident that we've done so, and we know what the final peace settlement will look like." And of course, this is not to criticize General Kellogg, just to say this was the American approach said by Secretary Rubio at the same time, I believe, in his testimony to Congress. So this is a distinctive approach to negotiations. Now let me read you a couple other quotes very quickly. Quote, "A diplomat's words must contradict his deeds. Must contradict his deeds. Otherwise, what sort of a diplomat is he? Words are one thing, deeds something entirely different. Fine words are amassed to cover shady deeds. A sincere diplomat is like dry water or a wooden iron." That's Stalin. Former President former President Medvedev, I can say what he is now. We know what he is now.
Yeah.
Said, this was also in June, the Istanbul talks are not for striking a compromise, peace on someone else's delusional terms, but for ensuring our swift victory and the complete destruction of the neo-Nazi regime. And he went on and on like that. So that's what he said about the same time as General Kellogg made his comments about the negotiations. And then finally, I refer you to an interview yesterday with Ambassador Andrei Kilin, who's the Russian ambassador to London, who gave an interview to Christian Amanpour on CNN. And he said, Ukraine must accept Moscow's terms for ending the war or face further military advances and eventual surrender. Russia's ambassador said, blah, blah, blah. We are now on the offensive and Ukraine is in retreat. In May, we have taken about 600 square kilometers of territory. And he goes on about the ultimatum for Kiev is surrender on our terms. We have control and must have, as a result of any peace talks, command over Kherson, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Lugansk, and of course also deny NATO membership to Ukraine. So my question for all of us here this evening is, do we have a disconnect here? And the obvious answer is I think that we do, and I think that's going to be the topic of our conversation. And my fundamental point would be the Russians and the West, especially the United States, see negotiations quite differently. And unless you unless you as the United States takes into account the Russian approach to these things, then I think the chances of success and a lasting settlement are not very, very high. I told you I'd be short.
Thank you. So we kind of segued into my first question pretty much. So what is the approach by the Russian diplomats and Russian negotiations? What is it and where it comes from?
Okay. And I repeat, the Russians see diplomatic negotiations very, very differently. For the Russians, negotiations are a tool of getting what you want. It's a weapon, it's a non-kinetic weapon of warfare. And this goes back not just to the Soviet era, this goes back to the Tsarist era as well. The Russians look at negotiating a certain way. My alma mater has there's something called the Harvard Negotiations Project, where win-win, both sides are supposed to win-win. And that's not how Vladimir Putin sees the situation. It's we win, you lose, and how can we make Russia prevail? That's the fundamental attitude, and that comes from Russian strategic culture, which we can talk about, which is enemies, imperial attitude, deception, and so forth. It comes from Soviet experience. I speak from personal experience about that, and that has continued on to today. And I would personally say that feeling of hostility to the West and that feeling of aggressiveness in negotiations is particularly marked in the last 10 years since the Obama administration, largely because of the growing numbers of KGB officers in the presidential security apparatus around Putin, who tend, not always, but tend to share this point of view. The US is the enemy, the West is the enemy, the international community, so-called rules-based international order, is no longer valid if it ever was valid. And this comes not from Putin's bad mood, this comes from a traditional way of looking at these talks that goes back really to the Tsarist period. So it makes it more difficult to change.
So when did it, so you're saying Tsarist times, is it imperial times? Because I'm interested in history always. So what do you think, when did it start? Was it imperial times? Because it would be surprising, because Russia during imperial times was very much plugged into the West. It was part of the Western world. It was a periphery or on the side, but it was a part of the European culture, Western culture.
It was.
Part of the army was based on all of that. It was very much, nothing could be decided in West without Russia in Europe. So, or is it before? Is it Tsarist times? Or is it Mongol times?
This argument, for those of you in graduate school, know that continuity versus change is always an argument. I would say the seeds are very early, where Russia saw itself as an empire. It saw the peoples outside of Russia as I was going to say inferior, people to be dominated by. Over the centuries, because of geography and other factors, Russia came to think of itself as an embattled fortress surrounded by enemies. So just as the US, I think, sees the international system a certain way, the Russians see it as a certain way as well. And that means their regime could be vulnerable, their regime is surrounded by enemies, and there are a lot of other, I think, continuities with that. I think the Bolshevik Soviet era accentuated the negative part of that because certainly the Tsarist empire was periodically wired into the West, but so was the Soviet Union. In fact, when I was in Foreign Service doing arms control, it was doing deals as well. But there's a general attitude toward diplomacy that I think is very old in Russia, but also zigzags at a given moment for a variety of other factors. In the 1980s, Gorbachev had a more conciliatory, accommodationist approach to the West, and that didn't mean they didn't want to dominate Ukraine. That didn't mean they didn't want to be communist. That it just meant that within the broader strategic culture, it's a loaded word in graduate school, but the broader set of cultural experiences that Russia has in their brain, there are policy differences, emphases at one point or another that could very well change. So in 1991, just because Yeltsin was relatively accommodationist toward NATO or toward Ukrainian autonomy didn't mean they didn't think they were better than the Ukrainians or could control them. It just meant they went about it in a different way, perhaps a softer way, and that immediately changed when Putin took over.
Mm-hmm. What was the difference between Gorbachev and Yeltsin, for example? And was there any difference? Well, one was a Soviet, one was more new Russia leader, but...
This could be a book, which I may write.
Yeah.
But, Gorbachev and Yeltsin in what way? I think Yeltsin, let me put it a different way. I think those of us in the embassy at the time, and there was somebody from one of my former colleagues in the audience, we thought that 91 was a democratic breakthrough for democratic forces for Russia that would result in a free market, more conciliatory Russian foreign policy. And for a while that lasted. And I would argue that it was not a democratic breakthrough, that Yeltsin represented a coalition of forces, nationalist, hyper-nationalist, pro-European Democrats around, and they were anti-Soviet more than they were Democrat. And I think, and if I would, my colleague is here in the audience, I would argue, based on what we reported back to Moscow, that, in fact, we were wrong. We thought it was a much more democratic move the country toward the West than it actually was. Many times people, you're having embassy cafeteria breakfast, you're talking about this stuff, and I would talk to someone who might have been for shock therapy, and I would say that this is going off the rails. And in fact, it did in 1993. And the answer was, well, it worked in Poland and the Czechoslovakia. It worked there. The theory is wrong. It's just the implementation. The theory is right. It's the implementation is wrong. And that's, to me, wasn't very convincing. It was going off the rails. You saw in the 93 shootout. You saw in the war in Chechnya. You saw in the increasing nationalist impulses of the later Yeltsin period, and of course with Putin. So the break between Yeltsin and Putin was not as sharp as it seems. And Gorbachev, however, was a convinced communist who wanted to reform the system. I don't think at the end Yeltsin really was. The joke at the time in the embassy was, Yeltsin's a Democrat, but he just doesn't know what it means. And so you have to be very, very careful, because people still argue about the 90s because we the West, we the United States, built a series of policies based on, frankly, a misperception of what happened in the 90s. So it's one thing if you're talking about accommodating Poland into NATO or Hungary. It's another thing to talk about accommodating Russia into NATO. And so there were successes, getting rid of the nukes, for example, in Ukraine, maybe. But there were many failures too, and part of it was our own fault for not having the foresight to see what was going on. I joke to my students that Americans have several difficulties in foreign policy repeatedly, and one is that we think that my friend Paul Goebel originally told me this, and I've embellished on it. Americans think that history doesn't matter. Number two, Americans think that culture doesn't matter. Three, Americans think that for every problem there's a solution. And fourth, if there's no solution, there must be no problem. Each one of those is wrong and misguided, but we have a certain habitual way of looking at the world, and frankly, Putin is challenging it, thus making negotiations much more difficult.
Mm-hmm. So would you say, you're saying that the negotiating style or the mood and the vibe in the Russian government never really changed, it stayed the same? Because I can argue that Putin in his early years was a rather pro-Western politician, and it changed in Munich. That's everybody says that in 2007. So do you think that it changed then, or it always really stayed the same? It's just morphed?
You're trying to trap me. This is another continuity versus change question. So I break it down into several aspects of it. There is diplomacy, negotiations as a tool of foreign policy. And there's something called coercive diplomacy. And I think the Russians today very clearly use negotiations as a tool of coercive diplomacy. Not always, not in every country, but certainly with the United States, and certainly with security questions, which is reportedly what Putin cares most about. But there are negotiation tactics that you see that the Russians use, and they've used it in Ukraine, with Ukraine today. They've used it 10 years ago. They've used it 20 years ago. And those tactics are surprisingly consistent. Not always, but surprisingly consistent. There is you handed out something I printed out, which is a textbook, and I reprinted selections from the course book for diplomats at MGIMO, which is the Moscow State University of International Relations, if I got that right. And those Russian diplomats are trained a certain way, which is very different than the way we train diplomats. And so when you see Russians pound the table or lie or be inconsistent or whatever you might characterize as typical Russian behavior, that tends to be taught as part of a diplomat's training before he becomes goes to an embassy.
It's deliberate. It's not an improvisation or emotion.
Oh no, it's a cultural mindset, but the cultural mindset takes the form of behaviors at the negotiating table that are surprisingly repetitive from era to era. I'll give you an example. So there's something called the Minsk negotiations from 2014 to whenever they petered out, 2018. And in the Minsk negotiations 10 years ago, the Russians claimed a special responsibility for Russian-speaking areas in eastern Ukraine. And you would ask, well, why do you have a special responsibility for Russian-speaking areas in eastern Ukraine? And they would either argue it's ours, Nasha, or they're oppressed, or whatever it might be. And they didn't even control those areas of Donbass, Lugansk, the ones that I mentioned. They complained they had a special responsibility, they said, at the time for this. Well, claiming control over an area that you don't even control has happened several times in recent Russian history, most notably in Minsk I. But when do we see it happening again? Right now. The quote I read you. The Russians claim those five areas, and the Russians don't fully control any of those 5 areas. They just say it's ours, given to us as a price for a deal. So that I use that as an example. So there is something called the Kremlin School of Negotiating, which ways that they're at get what they want. And I think sometimes it takes Westerners at the table with them, as I have been, time to get used to that, because you're sort of not accustomed to dealing with claims that might be so obvious you don't even bother to refute them. It seems the lying, the exaggerations, the inconsistency is very hard to deal with. If you look at Medvedev, some of the FSB guys on the delegation, Putin, the others who talk about this in the Kremlin, they often appear to disagree with one another. And I would argue that that is not necessarily a result of poor organization. It's probably just an attempt to keep the West off guard, off balance. I'm just suggesting that.
I think it's also exacerbated by where Putin is coming from, because he's a product of the 90s. That's when he became of age as a politician and as really an adult, like a full-grown man, or whatever you can say that. And there was a hard time in Russia. I remember it was a kid, but I remember it was a time of oligarchs and criminals and all of that.
And they know oligarchs now?
And well, touche. But yeah, and it was, that's how they, I guess, conducted their business in my way or the highway.
Yeah. So. I highly recommend, if any of you haven't read it yet, John Sullivan's memoirs of his time in Moscow, which was roughly 2020 to 22. It's available at all the bookstores. It's really good on Putin, and he calls it a KGB state. Mm-hmm. But he said that supposedly when he was head of the FSB in the late 90s, he even kept a statue of Brzezinski on his desk. Mm-hmm. And I've heard that before. I don't know if it's true, but again, the mentality that you described is there. If I could push back a little bit, I would say he's more pro-Western. He was more willing at the beginning to accommodate some of the Western
waiting for
waiting for reciprocity. Yeah. And why did that founded on, in many ways, human rights as the regime became tighter and more authoritarian. I think a lot of people in the United States and in the West, the Bush administration, could not support Khodorkovsky going to Siberia and some of the other things that were going on. The stripping of money from the first round of oligarchs and giving them to his friends. So again, it's hard to describe Putin in any one way, but certainly his authoritarian streak has been more evident in recent years.
Are there any organizations that Russia, international organizations, they use to move forward their agenda, to use as tools to advance their work?
Oh, of course, absolutely. Anybody a student here, you go home, you research it. There's international conferences, international Kremlin-funded organizations. There are spokespersons, and I won't name names, who are on the payroll of the Kremlin, who are there out to advance the Russian point of view. And it's not necessarily always to convince you, it's to create doubt. Because if you doubt, from what I read earlier, if you doubt Ukraine can win the war or defend itself, if you don't believe that Zelensky is a Nazi, all these things, which is the constant stream of Kremlin propaganda, then you just have to doubt. And if you doubt and you're recognize the Hungarian leadership or something, if you doubt, that's enough to put some brakes on. And if you track what happens in the battlefield with the Kremlin analytical line, they're a very close correlation. If there's negotiations pending the Kremlin will bomb Kiev, it will do other things, but the disinformation hybrid part of it is very, very noticeable if you track all of this stuff. And negotiations are a part of hybrid operations. And it's not that we can't get an agreement with them, it's that we have to understand where they're coming from to push back in the right way and not have sort of the zigzag we've had right now. I'm not blaming anybody, it's just saying that my fundamental point, which is they look at negotiations and foreign policy very, very differently than we do. I would also add that there's a commercial element to foreign policy that the Russians conduct that is also very, very evident. You saw in February that Kirill Dmitriev appears on the Russian delegations, and he's a Stanford graduate, oligarch kind of guy. And I thought to myself, I read that in the paper, and I said, well, why is he there all of a sudden? And the composition of the delegation does make a difference. And my own view would be that he's there to make sure that any commercial deals with the West as a result of negotiations that turn out well for the war, they want to get the money too, and there's a business angle to a lot of what the Russians do. Abramovich, I think, was an active in all this before Dmitriev appeared on the scene. Just like when you saw Medinsky, who aspires to cultural leadership, leading the delegation not only 3 years ago in 2022 when the war started, Istanbul, but also the recent one, you knew that Putin was not being serious because Medinsky is not the deepest man in the world in terms of his either diplomatic experience or his leadership of the cultural relevance. I debated him once on Russian television, and I didn't even understand what he was talking about. Okay. But maybe it was my problem.
Interesting. So let's move to today then. So do you think that Ukraine, with these new rounds in Turkey, has been more effective? Because according to that Kremlin school, you need to drag on negotiation if you can to exhaust your opponent. And in Minsk, we saw it when there was, 10 hours of negotiation, then another team came in. And the Ukrainian team was already exhausted, and they just accepted whatever they had, they were offered. So here,
you rotate people, you rotate delegations. First time it's going to be you guys, you can be the head of it. And then next time in Istanbul will be the two of you. And you can exhaust the West merely by outlasting them.
So these rounds, recent rounds in Istanbul, they were facilitated by US and Turkey. They were quite short. So do you think that Ukraine is actually doing better this time? Are they maybe more successful? That's why they were short? Would you? Yeah.
Yes. I think there are some Ukrainians in the room.
Something,
there are Ukrainians in the room, I believe, and I think the Ukrainians are very good at reading the Russian mentality and taking advantage of what they're very, very familiar with. In that sense, I think they're doing better. But the problem they have is that they're trying to keep a Western alliance behind them as well with dealing with the Russians. But I think overall, I've been very impressed. They make mistakes like everybody else, but the idea 2 years ago of these drone attacks on inside of Russia, that's really brilliant. And civilian casualties are relatively minor from what I understand. So the Ukrainians learn like everybody else does. The problem is really the other Western, Ukraine being Western, the other Western partners. If you're Britain or some of our NATO allies, it's very hard to think about the way Russians do this because we don't think about it that way. We have international law and we have all this other stuff, and the Russians believe it and have international law when it suits them, and when it doesn't, they do something else. And what happens here on this issue is different from what they do over here. And you say, well, wait a minute, there's the same situation. Well, they calculate it quite differently, and that's very hard for us sometimes to get our arms around. There are also little tricks that are always done, insulting somebody, talking for a long, long time, rotating personnel, like you said. And you have to read the stratagems because they do repeat themselves sometime. And if you are particularly fascinated by this subject, I notice the patterns office. The Russians pay close attention to U.S. domestic politics, to target certain people they think might be more sympathetic, or Italian, or with Spanish, or whatever it might be. And they pay very close attention to it. They sometimes don't get it right, and that's also very interesting too. But they link things. For example, the deputy foreign minister's name is Rabkov, and he, for the first couple of years of the war, kept saying, "We will not do a START treaty with you unless we have progress on Ukraine. And if not Q, then Y." And they will not budge on that, and to some extent have not yet on it. And I call it linkage. Others have other words for it, but it's a common practice of the Russians realizing they're strategically weaker than we are to leverage things to get their way. Focus on a vulnerability, focus on a weakness in your adversary, link things so that the Americans have to choose one and get rid of the other. When I was a START person, we probably weren't even born yet. The SDI petrified the Russians, the Strategic Defense Initiative that President Reagan announced. That's even before our time. And for several years, the Russians would not make progress on a START treaty unless we dropped SDI. And at some point, about 1986, they decided that SDI would never work anyway, and Gorbachev dropped it. So then you could proceed with progress on START. They decided SDI wouldn't work anyway, and then INF, which I worked. So they do things like that, and those are predictable tactical behaviors, maybe in that textbook selection that I had you pass out.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's for the Russian person, Soviet person, it's quite normal, that situation where one comes with the other. Because when you went to the store in Soviet Union, there was a practice at a certain time, and some people know that here, where if you wanted to buy something you want, you also had to buy something you don't want. So if you wanted to buy, I don't know, chicken, you also needed to buy socks or weights. And like, I don't need weights, but you had to buy them because you wouldn't get chicken. So
that's very interesting. I learned something.
Yeah. It's called deviation.
Also, it reinforces my point about the cultural continuity in their negotiations.
Exactly.
Yeah, they are. I don't want to generalize. They can be maximalist in their demands, and they back off when pressure. Or they can be maximalist in their demands and not back off. And the job for us is to figure out what's the difference, and that's a real challenge.
So do you think that how Russia sees peace then? Because do you think that the rise of China added to the boldness of Russia?
The boldness?
To the boldness in negotiation, in more aggressive style, and that rhetoric of the fall of the Western world, because China is rising and
I would say
West is falling and all of that.
Probably not, because I do not consider the Chinese approach to international negotiations as bold and aggressive. I think of it as
well, but maybe it added to the Russian. Maybe they see
perhaps
something behind them. The big guy behind
Jenny, that's an interesting point. Perhaps Putin feels more reassured and can be more aggressive. I suspect it comes from other things. But that's something I actually will think about.
The Western was finally falling. We have other guys.
Yeah. The Chinese are certainly effective. They also, I think, see the world, the Chinese and the Russians see the world differently. The Russians see the international post-war order as something that has benefited the U.S. and the West.
Post-World War II.
Post-World War, yeah, I guess, the post-World War II world. And they want to blow it up. And the chaos, the anarchy advanced by various techniques, such as negotiations in their style, helps do that. I think the Chinese are less interested in blowing it up, but want to profit more from it and be one of the co-big powers. But if you look at the comments, public comments of, I actually follow this, of the Siloviki, the hardline Russian intelligence elements, they talk about this a lot, and they talk about, they do have differences, but it's kind of this quasi-Dugin, half-baked philosophy of Russian nationalism. So they do pay attention to it. Whether they believe it, I don't know. It's hard to say. But Putin talks about that kind of thing.
Has it ever backfired, this approach?
Yeah, it could backfire, yeah. And I think there's a tendency, and I think the Keeling quote here reflects it. Their information is often not as good as it could be. And second, they exaggerate Russia's own strength. And I think that's something that is a frequent mistake that the Russians might make. Syria, for example, maybe Iran, these things are, I would guess, are not something they particularly expected. And I think I have a friend who worked in the Security Council in the Kremlin, and she's now retired in Virginia, and she said they always overestimate their ability to control people and events, and they being the Russians. And the Maidan issue, she was a note-taker with meetings with Yanukovych and Putin and other Ivanov, and she said that Putin thought, and this may not be true, but they think they can buy or bribe anybody or push anybody around, and they are not as good as they could be about grassroots pressure, popular pressure for change from below. And this is just one person's opinion. That's one reason why they did not maybe fully take into account the significance of the Maidan revolution. They're not good at that very, very well. Some of my former friends I used to have contact with have trouble understanding what a legislature does fully. And the same thing with the courts. I have an anecdote to confirm that, but it's a good anecdote. I can't talk about it. But again, it's a problem because things that we take for normal, granted, like separation of powers, I think there's ideas. Those are ideas that are independent judiciary. Those are ideas that are pretty alien, toujours, to countries in a lot of parts of the world, and you can't really understand a Western society fully, or much maybe as you should if you don't take that into account. But every country has its flaws.
Yeah. So do you think, what is the answer then? Is it possible to negotiate effectively with Russia? Do you have to always keep Russia in a weaker position to guarantee peace? And is it possible to have a lasting peace with Russia on normal terms, not on in a Cold War situation, more in a normal coexisting situation?
Of course it is.
And
of
how?
course it is.
And how? What do you think? How?
Number one, you have to know how they operate, and you have to know how they operate strategically. Know why they sometimes go to the negotiating table, like Putin now over Ukraine. You have to know that that's largely window dressing. Yeah, they have no interest in negotiating a peace settlement at the moment. There's something in negotiations theory called ripeness, which means that issues evolve, and at some point, whether the countries give up on an outcome that favors one or the other, or for other reasons, that makes an issue ripe for sitting down and talking. And even the Russians realize that when you get through all the nonsense of the nonsense at the table and the fascism accusations, the Russians realize that too. So first, know how they operate. Second, realize that if backed into a corner or in a situation where a proposed deal will clearly benefit them too, and there are no alternatives, I think you can certainly have a deal with them. And just maybe not right now. But look at the positive things that have happened since the end of the Cold War, the START treaties. There was an Iran agreement that held for 10 years, and there was a START treaty under Obama. There was the Afghan Northern Distribution Route agreement, all of which have elements of what I've been talking about, but all of which the sides managed to come to some kind of a success, if not a permanent success. So, as a case study, I remember I give my students, why did the Russians sign up to the Iran agreement in the JC, whatever it was, in 2014? Well, they saw security and economic benefits from signing it too, and I think the general atmosphere with the United States was a little bit better than it was now, and thought that the U.S. probably would live up to its end of the bargain. The START or SALT, whatever it's called now, in 2011, very contentious in negotiating, and the Russians, throughout the course of the talks, did what they always do. They kept changing things at the last minute. They would agree and then say, "No, I've got to cable Moscow." The answer is no, and that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, they came up with an agreement that both sides could more or less live with. But we have to understand, most fundamentally, that for Russia, negotiations is a form of competition and ultimately non-kinetic warfare with the West. So this has certain lessons, in my own personal view, for Ukraine, one of which is that you have to realize that you can't take over Ukraine, and they won't take over Ukraine, or the Russians have vulnerabilities militarily, not talked about as much as it should, economically. I think also that the public opinion in favor of the war, which appears overwhelming, is really not that deep when you get down to it. The hardcore Putin support, I would say, is less than it might appear. But you can't tell because, as we've seen, the Putin system appears brittle. Things like Prigozhin happen, the Crocus bombing, the incursion of Ukraine into Kursk last year. Those things happen almost out of nowhere, and I think, however stable the system is on the surface, I don't ever take it for granted that that's all that's there, ever. I think Gorbachev had a comment about Russia's like the taiga, the wind. He had the opposite comment. The wind blows, but the base, nothing changes. But I think societies do change. But the issues of how you see the world are much more difficult, and how you negotiate and what you settle for are much more difficult to get a handle on. And I think people who talk with the Russians often aren't fully aware of that enough, because they think that the Russians approach this just as we do, and they simply don't.
Mm-hmm. Well, we kind of moved to the next question pretty much, and then we're going to wrap up in questions from you guys.
I brought my water. Catch it.
Go ahead. So I got to ask you, so about Ukraine and Russia, since you started talking about it already, what are the main goals now, the realistic goals that Russia sees now at the negotiating table? Because they want these regions, they want the whole Ukraine, whatever they want, that's separate. But what do they think that they can do?
There is no agreement on that, of course, and
yeah, but
I think that they would probably settle for a frozen conflict, Ukraine neutralized. They're still far apart. We're a long ways from that. They would probably settle for the less than maximalist goals that they talked about more often than now 2 or 3 years ago, and maybe a neutral Ukraine. All of these things the Ukrainians won't accept. So that's one of the reasons why it's not ripe for negotiation.
Neutral meaning disarmed or just neutral
I
status?
mean, they would probably go with a small Ukrainian military. Disarmed, no, but smaller, yes. I think that if pressed way into the negotiations, Putin would probably have not as much of a problem with EU membership than he would with NATO. Mm-hmm. And NATO was one of the great invented crises of the Putin era. So I think there's an outline there, sort of, but we're a long way from getting there. And when you claim Donbass and you don't control it, I don't know. I don't see any Russian withdrawal because, as we all talk about every day in this neighborhood, the Russian economy is so highly militarized. The Russian way of looking at the world now is so shaped by the fighting. Backing down or even settling for Putin, a settlement sponsored by Putin may or may not stick. And certainly, I think the majority of opinion of the expert community is that if Putin said for ceasefire and some other things that Ukraine might be able to buy into, that probably would stick at home. But I do think that there is a very hard line group in the Kremlin which would not want to fight that.
So you don't see the Afghanistan situation, you see more like a Moldova situation.
Yeah, I mean, the Transnistria?
You don't see an Afghanistan situation,
Oh,
you see more
Moldova. Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
I don't know how you can go on losing 1,000 guys a day.
That's
and I think the Iran business is
maybe the economic pressure won't break it eventually.
What's break? It's Russia. I think the Iran thing is really significant because they are not going to give them any more technology or missiles or drones, meaning somebody's got to make that up, and I don't think the North Koreans are quite ready to do that.
Well, the ambassador in Great Britain said that we are fine. We have developed our own industry. I listened to the...
Yeah, They always say, you know what, that this is the challenge for you as an expert now. That's what he's supposed to say. Kalin is also well known for an interview he gave about 2 years ago because there was a debate about whether Russian diplomats have actual authority at the table to do any discretion at all. And he said, of course we do, but there's increasingly, I find it difficult to see that on something like this, the Ukraine war, that I would think it almost all goes to the top and has to be yes or no by Putin. I was in one of the first, maybe the first Soviet missile base we ever inspected in 1988. It was SS-20s, and I told one of the officers and his wife, I remember this, that we were unsure when we landed in Moscow and then went to the base, and there's rockets all over the place, what would happen. But it was a relatively smooth inspection, and he said that's because Gorbachev told him to make it work.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think with Ukraine you have that just yet.
Thank you. And questions? Okay, let me.
And I'm getting over an ear infection. So if I go what, it's not age, it's mileage.
Right. I had a question because I'm not really sure that the Russians are interested in negotiating. And you mentioned this a conclusion to the war with Ukraine, and I think what appears is that they're really just pursuing a war of attrition, and that the longer time goes on, they're going to take over more and more territory of Ukraine. And I think that's really inevitable given the military forces that Russia has and what Ukraine has and the Western support, which is starting to wane for the Ukrainian military effort, notwithstanding the drone attacks and taking out some of the strategic bombers in Siberia. And that really, it was kind of a spectacular event, but it doesn't change the facts on the ground in Ukraine on the battlefield. And so I think the question I have is, the course of diplomacy is what the U.S. is trying to do now with Iran by basically sending aircraft carriers into the Persian Gulf and repositioning military assets to let Iran know, if you don't negotiate, we've got military assets here. Russia's not doing coercive diplomacy. They're already at war. I mean, they're pounding Ukraine every day, killing people, destroying infrastructure, et cetera. The question I have is it similar to what you had in Russia in World War I after the overthrow of the Tsar, when Lenin came to power and he saw the disastrous results of the Russian military against the German forces and immediately sued for peace and ceded large swaths of territory. Do the Russians really think that Ukrainians at some point are just going to throw up their hands, okay, keep Crimea, keep the 4 eastern oblasts, maybe 1 or 2 more, maybe more additional? I mean, at what point do the Russians think enough is enough and that the Ukrainians are just going to say that's it? We've sue for peace, essentially. It's not a
A lot
negotiation.
of questions here.
Right.
If on your first point, I may have not been elegant enough in my explanation. That I think the Russians are. What was your first point? It was that the Russians are winning.
Yeah, I think the Russians
I don't
clearly
think they're
are
winning at all.
You don't think they're winning?
No, I think one of the most deceiving. I think the Russians are. Give me a complicated answer. I don't think the Russians are winning by some key measures, one of which is Ukrainian resilience, one of which is the Russian economy. I think the Russians have some serious problems of their own. Yes, if you look at ground occupied, they are slowly moving forward. But do the math. At this rate, they will get to Ukraine in like 2050, get to Kiev in about 2050. There is something called Russia Matters, which Harvard puts out every week. And that first item, sir, is always how many square kilometers of Ukraine Russia occupies.
Right.
And I think they gained the size of Manhattan. They gained the size of Manhattan last week. Well, yeah, but Ukraine is almost, the war had put on Russian economy likely into recession. They've lost 1 million guys. I mean, I don't think you should look just at the front. As impressive as the Ukrainian resistance has been. So are the Russians operationally have the advantage on the ground? I think probably you're right. Yeah. But go back to the testimony of General Kavali, who a NATO commander who testified in Congress, I think in March or February. His parents go to my parish, Holy Rosary, down the street here. His very elegant way of looking at who wins and who isn't. But I think the Rubio formulation more recently is the Russians aren't strong enough to win, and Ukrainians aren't strong enough to take back what the Russians occupy.
But I don't think
and that may end up a frozen comment.
Right. I think it is, and I don't think the Russians want to take over the whole country, and they might not want to take over Kiev. But I think if they can control a significant chunk of eastern Ukraine and Crimea, I think they would be satisfied, and they could basically neutralize the western Ukraine and Kiev, and ensure that you have a kind of a Finlandization of Ukraine.
Yeah, that probably is the case in large part. If Putin decided to do that, they would probably do that. But I follow the hardliners in particular very closely, what they say on Telegram channels, and I don't think for a moment that a lot of those people don't want to take over the whole country. Just go to the map that Medvedev put on about 2 months ago. I don't think for a moment, and you ask a Ukrainian, and they will say they want everything. But you have a third point too, which was also, what was your third point?
Well, I think the third point was the Tsarist Lenin capitulation in 1917-18 because of the disastrous performance of the Tsarist army against Germany. Do the Russians actually think that Zelensky will be in a position like that at some point, that he'll just have to capitulate?
And he will have to, or they will.
That Zelensky will have to capitulate.
I probably think a lot of them probably do. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think Ukrainians will ever stop fighting in one way or the other, ever. It's not Belarus, and this has galvanized Ukrainians' identity, and they're not going to surrender. And if you put tanks in Kyiv, they're going to be old ladies bombing them all the time. And I'm not sure the Russians. This goes back to my point about top-down control. You think you can control the whole country by putting the Temanskaya division in Lviv or in Kharkiv, and I just don't think that's the case. Russians could occupy it, but that's not the same as taking it. But I still think we're a long way from that. And you notice how this is a multidimensional Russian operation. There's the military, there's the attempts to destabilize the Western alliance, so they don't give any more equipment. But there's also the dependence of the Russian economy on the war. But what happens a year from now, 6 months? I don't know. I'm not saying something will happen. Again, in terms of the whole currents around Putin. There are currents, I think. They are just pretty quiet. And I go back and read the Prigozhin events hour by hour from 2 years ago, 3 years ago, whenever it happened, 3 years ago. The system is in its own way brittle. And you have these black swan events that happen, and I think they're almost always unexpected. The attack on the bombers a couple of weeks ago, what? You got 500,000 security officers, they couldn't stop that, what's going on? So you have that problem in the Russian system, which I think makes it more vulnerable than it might otherwise appear. It's not the French army, it's a much more different kind of country. But you know, that's how I'm not saying yes or no to you, I'm saying it could happen. And I think you have to read, when you read the stuff daily, and it's my job, but if you read the stuff daily, there are certain places you can go to read what's going on that are really pretty good. Just focus on that stuff, and I think you get the full flavor of the I'm Italian, and I do this a lot, the multidimensionality of the conflict. But I think the Ukrainians have been impressive in their defense. The Ukrainians are impressive in the way that they have pulled together. I know Zelensky has problems and all that, I get that, but they've been very, very impressive, and I don't think that's close to ending. Now, maybe they want to pause. I don't know. But we just have to see. Would Putin, if you offered Putin right now some of what he asked for, he might take it. He might not take it because the Ukrainians will never say small arms. They'll never say it. Because everybody who's been to Ukraine is a European, Western-thinking country. No question about it. This is never going to end. And the problem is further east. Talk to younger generations. I dropped some.
Thank you for this fascinating talk. I have multiple questions, but I'm going to ask you maybe a couple of them.
Louder, please.
Yeah, louder? Okay. I saw the interview that you mentioned, Russian ambassador to the UK. Given what you said about...
Ambassador Killing?
Yeah, to UK, yeah. The interview you mentioned, yeah. Given how they lie, exaggerate, blah, 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 right? How much of it do you trust, whatever he said? That's one. Second one is, Trump lies, exaggerates, tackle, he says something and then chickens out, right? Okay. What ambassadors do versus, what Trump is doing. My other one is the meeting between Trump and Zelensky at the White House. As an ambassador with decades of experience, how do you look at it? And my other one is, how do you look at Trump? Given your understanding of how multiple presidents handle different issues. My final question is, given there are so many countries bordering Russia, which other countries do you think understand Russia very well, just like Ukrainians understand?
Well, on the first question, two questions. I don't want to comment on U.S. politics. It's just to say that they read it very carefully, to almost they being the Russians, to very carefully try to exploit what they perceive to be weaknesses in the British or French or American approaches. That's all I really can say. And it's very impressive sometimes the level of attention they put to it. You'll see, what's her name, Zakharova? The press, your friend Zakharova, press spokesman for the State Department for the MFA, comment on something that you in the United States or London, you miss. What? But they do pay a lot of attention. But again, a lot of it is they're a victim of their own disinformation in a way, which is to say, they hype things that don't matter and they don't take to sufficient account, in my view, things that do matter, which are quieter and less sensational. So again, that's about all I can say about that. The second question was? Good question. Yeah,
Trump and Zelensky, as an ambassador, how do you look at it? What happened?
Yeah, how do you read that stuff?
Yeah.
Well, we have an ambassador in the room. I'm not going to ask him or her because I wouldn't put him or her on the spot. But you get guidance from Moscow. about this. And this particular line that I read is straight out of the current public Russian negotiations playbook, except he got the amount of mileage, kilometers wrong. He's parroting what he's supposed to say. They're very good at acting like they believe it, and maybe they do. But it's not really that important whether they believe it or not. He's saying what he's supposed to say. And if you go to these negotiations sessions, let's say in this room, they always have FSB or SVR guys there to make sure to watch their people on that, probably more than they watch the other side. So they don't want any stray wandering animals walking around in all of this. But there is a problem with, from my estimate, there is a problem with the way Russian decisions are made, which is to say, from all that I can read telegram channels, Putin is very, very isolated in his ability to get information from various independent sources. And remember the famous February 2022 press conference where he's here and he's yelling at whoever, the street, Naryshkin. He's yelling at Naryshkin about this, but I think that was more for staging, from what I understand. Putin's very isolated. From what we can see from the postmortems on the invasion of Ukraine to begin with, and some other information, like bureaucracies all over the place, they package information for the president that makes them look good. And that would never happen in any other country, I'm sure. And that means that Putin's ability to decide is based on real stuff is really, really almost probably, from the Russian point of view, harmfully impaired. And I mentioned information and all that. That information, that invasion of 2022, even though they recovered to an important extent, was a disaster. And that was the FSB, from what I can tell, who did that. If you look at the Russian delegation in attendance, sorry for talking so much, at one of the Istanbul sessions, the Saudi session, there's a famous fifth director at FSB, general named Becerra, who was part of the delegation. The fact that he was there is interesting because Western experts have often argued or thought that Putin blamed him for the disaster in February 2022. But evidently he's been rehabilitated, if you can judge by the picture. So again, information is a really important thing for Putin too. And I don't think he has the variety of reasonably objective sources that a lot of Western leaders do, which makes that the decision about negotiations or who's winning probably more difficult to get right, because you don't have the free press running all over the place, or Harvard calculating what square kilometer of land that they occupy. So it makes the Kremlin decision-making process, and this is obviously hard to know from the outside, much more prone to error than perhaps to the point of being dangerous for the Russian side. I don't know, but I think you have to look at it that way. There's no big meetings with people, this number of people, to talk about what to do in Ukraine, as far as I can tell. There's not. It's Putin and a couple other guys, or Putin, from what people say on things like Telegram channels.
And a big table. Long table.
Big time. He's here, and the other guys are over. They're over at Union Station, and you're yelling, and I don't think that's exactly how that happens.
I think you've touched on this a little bit in your talk so far. Louder. Is it on? It is on. Okay. So, okay, sure. So, I mean, you touched on this a little bit in your talk. I don't doubt that there's a Russian style of negotiating, but when you look at the Istanbul negotiations, including in 2022, and if I recall correctly, the Ukrainian delegation returned with signs of poisoning. If you look at some of the Minsk negotiations, we could probably say that we could ask the question, is this the Russian style of negotiating, or do they just not care? They don't really want anything, they don't need anything from these negotiations. And it raises a question, I think, that maybe if they needed something from the negotiations, really needed something, their negotiating style might seem less Russian to us in that sense. So my question for you is that how do we, in your opinion, distinguish when that we're dealing with the Russian style of negotiating versus they're just phoning it in because they don't actually want to get anything from these negotiations and they view it simply as, just a performance. You do it to look productive so that you can keep doing what you actually want to do. And that I don't think is a unique Russian feature of negotiating. That's a feature of many, I would suspect, non-democratic countries, even sometimes democratic countries, just in the way that, elections are something you have to do nowadays, even if you're not a democratic country, but you don't have to do them truly democratically, you just need to perform them, if that makes sense.
Repeat the question.
So
Performance or real negotiations?
my question is, how do we know the difference when we're dealing with the Russian style of negotiations sincerely versus when they're just doing a simulacrum of negotiations because it just...
I think that, good question. I think that is the Russian style of negotiations, performance. And you have to deal with it, realize that this is how they operate, and hone on, and realize that's how they operate, and focus on areas where you think you can compromise, where they have no alternative but to agree, agreements that are enforceable. Notice all arms control agreements have verification measures. You can get what you want, but the performance is part of the negotiating style. And don't take it perhaps as seriously. When I saw Medinsky there, I thought this is a joke. You might as well have the Three Stooges, which is before your time, I'm sure.
I know what the...
On the other hand, almost before my time, the Vietnam negotiations lasted, 2 years? 3 years? I think at every stage, those were relatively serious talks by the U.S. with the North Vietnamese. But they were clearly more substantive. They had no one that I'm aware of who was the equivalent of Medinsky or Kirill Dmitriev trying to ensure business deals funneled enough money to somebody.
So, I mean, there's a question then, is it, I mean, when do you know that it's worth engaging in these negotiations versus just walking away? Because if they're performative and not sincere, how do you decide as on the other side of the table when it's worth actually engaging?
You get the Nobel Prize for that. My answer would be ask Zelensky. You don't know for sure ever. How do you know whether the Russians are going to compromise on the issue of NATO enlargement? Well, you don't. And as questions come up, we had a group like this that fielded these questions for 2 years at the start question. Things come up, and you vet it, and you do a counter proposal. And Rose Gottmiller's book on the negotiations of 2011 is very good with an inside perspective on how it works. And if you're interested in this stuff, I highly recommend her book. Rose Gottmiller. She was, I think, the lead U.S. negotiator. What's the 2011? That round, and it's always cited as a achievement of the reset. Now, one could argue that the aborted but still once promising reset of relations between Moscow and Washington created an atmosphere in which a treaty like that was possible, and thus perhaps a general improvement in the climate of relations would lead to more agreements. I don't know, but that's one argument that has been. I'm afraid I'm going to drop this.
Can I just add one on that? Because I think
He's the moderator.
Oh, I'm sorry. Negotiations on kind of wars are different from other negotiations because they really are zero-sum outcomes. There's a winner and a loser. But all other negotiations really are win-win or positive-sum outcomes. And so the Russian negotiating style in those, whether it's negotiating an S&T agreement, an arms control agreement, NASA space cooperation agreement, agreements that we had, cultural exchange agreements, where Russia is really going to benefit, they're likely to not be performative in their negotiating style because they get something out of it. But on Ukraine, it's purely performative because I mean, this is my view, because they believe they're winning and they believe that the longer time goes by, they're just going to win more. So why give up anything at the negotiating table?
But
Exactly.
just to answer your point, sir, but you have to realize, look at the way, this is not picking on you. Talk about an agreement, we talk about, as you know, we talked about implementation, so forth. Those are legal terms that are something that the Americans or the French or Germans are much more comfortable with than the Russian behavior, because one of my arguments would be that the Russian negotiating heritage or approach puts much less value on in long-term legally binding arrangements. They will go along with it if it benefits them, but if they don't, they'll cheat. And that's a lesson I think we're yet to fully internalize.
Follow-up. Were the March-April 2022 negotiations from the Russian side sincere? Did they want to reach an agreement? There was the big Sergei Radchenko, Samuel Charap article that seemed to settle on, yes, they really did. They cite Alexander Chalet from the Ukrainian side, who talked about how, as you said, Putin was shocked that Ukrainians were fighting back. He desperately needed to reach a deal, but they sent Medinsky, and they did not reach a deal. Did they want to reach a deal in March, April 2022? I agree, no.
You asked me, did he?
Did the Russian side?
God, that's an excellent question.
Did the Russian side want to make peace in March 2022?
This is my personal view. There's no consensus. All the people you see on CNN, there's no consensus. I would say Putin, from what I recall, Putin in March 2021 decided he would go ahead, build and have an invasion, threatened and was willing to carry it out if they didn't give him what he wanted on Ukraine. And so he would take the negotiated outcome, negotiating process, if it gave him what he wanted, which was control of Ukraine. Once that hit a brick wall, then he went to the military alternative. You see, so that the negotiations and kinetic forces or related approaches in a multidimensional, the H word people, the hybrid approach. He wanted X. He started with the diplomacy, coercive diplomacy, and switched to a regular armed force when that fell through. However, you probably remember we talked about giving him Putin an off-ramp. I never thought that, I don't even know if giving him an off-ramp isn't a Russian phrase. I think that was a mistaken effort by some people in the West to approach the problem within a framework of the Western negotiating style. I don't think Putin saw it as, or wanted ever, or dreamed about, or whatever, wrote an off-ramp. Putin wanted to use diplomacy to get what he wanted. And they were given many chances to, they being the non-Russian sides, given many chances to go along with that on Russian terms. And when they didn't, at some point he pushed the button and said, okay, that's over and we're going to do this. I do think it's interesting that I do think that this was such an elaborate diplomatic dance that I think he, meaning Putin, may have thought that the West could force Ukraine to do ultimately what it didn't want to do. Second, he probably, almost certainly, underestimated Ukrainian reluctance to go along with it. And that led to the disastrous March 2022 Istanbul discussions you're familiar with. So it was a multidimensional theater, but I don't think, as I described it, is what I think happened. But we spent months between the fall of 2021 and March 2022 debating the off-ramp issue. What does he really want? And what do all these troops mean? There's 200,000 Russian troops across the border from Sumy, and he's looking for an off-ramp? Are you crazy? But that debate is not settled, and that would be my view of what happened.
Do you think the Russian negotiating style with respect to Ukraine would be different if it was done on a bilateral basis just between Russia and Ukraine, as opposed to a multilateral basis with the U.S. and the European
The
countries?
Ukrainians, I think, are much more willing to resist than some people in the West might be. Yes, I think the case. I want to emphasize a point which I maybe didn't extract. If you look at negotiating processes, Russia in Central Asia, or Russia, Cuba, or Russia, Venezuela, has much less of this harder edge than it does when the U.S. and it's about security, all of that. This issue, I focus maybe too much on issue of security issues regarding the West, but if it's Azerbaijan or labor migration from Central Asia into Russia, the Russians are often more stabilizing or more conservative, that word, than here. I'm talking about contentious issues at the top of the agenda.
Just to follow up on that,
On this?
yes, there are, in terms of intermediaries between Russia and Ukraine, it has seemed to me for quite a while the U.S. and Europe have very little clout with Russia, but there are potential intermediaries who do have some clout. Turkey being one of them, Erdogan, potentially, I don't know, someone else in the Middle East could. Do you think that the involvement of maybe Erdogan or someone else as an intermediary could move negotiations between Russia and Ukraine forward, or is that a dead end in any case?
Good question. Depends on, I'll be overly clever. It depends on the media.
Well, so Erdogan then is the one I'm.
India has been talked about, China, Saudis.
But I think the difference that India and China are viewed as much more pro-Russian intermediaries, whereas
I think so too.
Turkey has a very interesting position on
If you
Ukraine.
go elsewhere, get back to your point about bilateral, direct or not. If you go, it's a tough one. It's tough. And that's one reason why I think neither the situation is right for settling or is it right for militarily. It's just going to have to play itself out, tragically, as that is.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to conclude here. I wanted to say thank you for coming, and please, if you can donate, you see these QR codes posted. It would help us a lot to offset some of the costs of running the house, and if you can, anything would be great. And I would like to thank Dr. Jensen for this wonderful discussion. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you. Please go enjoy the hors d'oeuvres and refreshments.